Hello ladies and gents, and welcome to the first proper video of #Bannockburn Month. Today we're going to have a look at King Edward II of England. He is of course the English commander at the Battle of Bannockburn. We're going to have a look at what brought him to Bannockburn in June 1314, what motivated him I suppose, but also maybe have a think about the pressure he was under when he got to Bannockburn in late June 705 years ago. Now, those of you who watched the video I posted last week, the announcement video I suppose you would call it, you will hopefully remember that at this point, kind of early June 705 years ago, 1314, Edward was already up in the northeast of England putting the finishing touches to the muster of his army, an army that he had been mustering since the spring, since sort of March, April sort of time, that he had actually been talking about putting together as early as November 1313. So this army that Edward is bringing together in the summer of 1314 has been a project some 7 or 8 months in the making. This is quite a serious undertaking for Edward. And you'll remember that from the 27th of May, the stated purpose of this army is to go north and relieve Stirling Castle, which had been placed under siege by the Scots. However, initially, the plan, when this army is first put together, when Edward is first mooting the idea of putting this army together in November 1313, and indeed when he's sending out the earliest muster orders in the spring, the idea behind this army was simply to go north, to campaign through Scotland, to try to bring Robert Bruce to battle. Robert Bruce, the pretender King of Scots, as far as Edward is concerned, to bring him to battle, to defeat him, and ideally to try and kill or capture him. Now, on the face of it, this might be a bit of a bad idea on Edward's part, in the context of the spring and the summer 1314. Edward does not have the best track record when it comes to dealing with affairs in Scotland. Robert Bruce, of course, as we've looked at in other videos, becomes King of Scots in 1306. In February 1306, he kills his rival John Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries, and after that declares himself King of Scots. At the time, Edward II's father, Edward I, is on the throne, but is kind of old and kind of sick at this point, and so he doesn't, at least initially, come north to try and deal with Robert himself. Instead, he sends a force under the command of Aymer de Valence, the eventual Earl of Pembroke, acting as guardian of Scotland, basically, on the part of Edward I. Valence beats King Robert, beats Bruce at the Battle of Methven in June 1306, and as Bruce flees west from Methven, he is ambushed at a place called Tindrum by a force led by the MacDougals, relatives of his predecessor as King of Scots, John Balliol. Bruce loses this battle at Tindrum as well. His army melts away, and Bruce spends a pretty miserable, presumably, winter from 1306 to 1307. We don't really know where he spends that winter or how he spends that winter. Probably he is travelling through the Western Highlands, travelling through the Hebrides, through Gaelic Scotland, trying to drum up some support for his ailing kingship. When he does return to Scotland, or to mainland Scotland, when he reappears in records in the spring of 1307, he's back down in Carrick, his kind of homeland, the earldom that he inherited from his father and from his mother. He is again at the head of an army. The army of Carrick, the kind of local tenants, all turn out to support Bruce, and he seems to have been able to get at least some of the denizens of Gaelic Scotland, of the Western Highlands and the Hebrides, to come out and fight for him as well. he enjoys a victory of sorts at the Battle of Loudon Hill. Now, how much of a battle actually goes on, how much of a conflagration the Battle of Loudon Hill is a matter of some debate, which we can look at in another video. But the important thing is that it is a success for Bruce, and it is at the very least an embarrassment for the English. And this finally provokes Edward I to come north in person, hoping to deal with Bruce, hoping to meet him on the battlefield and defeat him, just as Edward I had done to William Wallace about 9 years earlier at the Battle of Falkirk. However, before even getting into Scotland, Edward I dies. He is succeeded, of course, by his son, Edward II, who basically decides that he is not interested in pressing this issue. At that moment, he returns south. He essentially disbands the army that Edward I had been leading up into Scotland, decides basically that he wants to deal with domestic issues. Not necessarily a bad decision on his part, but certainly doesn't do any favours for the English and their allies in Scotland, because by not following up his father's intended campaign in Scotland, he essentially gives Bruce some time, some breathing room with which to start working against English interests in Scotland. And in fact, over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, from at least 1307 to 1309, Bruce is given time and space with which to deal with his native opponents, the Scots who refuse to recognise him as king. Families like the Commons, families like the MacDougals, relatives and supporters of the previous Balliol regime, rather. Bruce has time to apply pressure to them, to drive out those who flatly refuse to recognise him, and to strong arm any fence sitters into coming over into the Bruce camp. And so it's not until 1310 that we see Edward II once again actively trying to intervene in Scotland, actively trying to have an impact on the course of this war, or this rebellion, if you want to take it from an English perspective. So in 1310, Edward II does finally put together an army, comes north, notionally in support of his remaining allies in Scotland. But again, the plan in 1310, really ideally, is to get the Scots, is to get Bruce on the battlefield, to beat him, and if at all possible, to get their hands on him, to capture him, or else to kill him. And this campaign, in 1310, it has to be said, is a pretty embarrassing failure. Edward is not beaten in battle, not by any stretch of the imagination, on that campaign in 1310, and actually he remains in Scotland right the way into the early part of 1311, so he's in Scotland for a good long while, and is not really seriously challenged by the Scots in all the time that he's here. However, the reason for this is that he doesn't see hide nor hair of Bruce, or even many of the Bruce Scots. He doesn't get an opportunity to deal with the Scots, to beat them in battle, to try and get his hands on Bruce. He can't even find him. We know that Bruce spends a little bit of time in the Lennox, very difficult country for the English, this big, heavy, slow-moving English army, the English royal host. Difficult country, the Lennox, for that kind of army to move through, whereas Bruce's highly mobile guerrilla forces can quite easily hide out in the mountains and the glens and the forests of the Lennox. We know that Bruce spends some time there because he actually sends a letter to Edward during that period, which on the face of it is quite a nice, pleasant, polite letter, basically requesting that some kind of negotiated settlement is arranged. But there is a kind of snotty undertone to that letter, really. In effect, Bruce is signalling that he is eager for an end to the war and for a negotiated end to the war, but making it clear that that can only happen if Edward is prepared to recognise Bruce as the rightful King of Scots and to negotiate, not to fight. Bruce is not going to give Edward an open battle, because that's not the kind of confrontation that Edward Robert, that Bruce can win. Bruce is much happier letting Edward muck around in the south of Scotland, and then once he goes home he'll resume this dirty, bitter, nasty guerrilla war that has been working so well for the Scots over the last few years. Edward eventually in 1311 is forced to return home to disband his army again, and he is met, when he does return home, with a series of ordinances, a series of complaints, come demands from his barons. In his absence, a council of barons, the Lords Ordainer as they're known, have met together and have come up with this list of things that they are sick of, these examples of government mismanagement as far as they are concerned, that Edward is guilty of, and a series of demands that, if Edward will accept them, they claim will kind of sort things out, will set the government of England right. And of course, having wasted a great deal of time and money and energy in Scotland, Edward is in somewhat of a weak position politically when he comes back, and so he's effectively forced to accept and acquiesce to these ordinances. Now, one of those ordinances says that Edward is not allowed to raise another army, which of course raising an army is expensive. That expense is borne by the barons, by the nobility for the most part. So Edward is not allowed to raise another army without first consulting Parliament, without first checking that the baronage of England are okay with this expense, are happy to foot the bill for whatever adventure he's wanting to go off. Well, go off on, I suppose. Now, this is quite understandable. The English political community have been paying for aggressive, expansionist, kind of wasteful wars in France, in Ireland, in Wales and in Scotland since the reign of Edward I, since the reign of Edward II's father. So it's no surprise really that after decades of this, the English political community are getting sick of it, and to some extent Edward is just unlucky that he has inherited this legacy from his dad, from Edward I. He accepts notionally the ordinances, but certainly not happily. And so, in 1313, Edward, when he decides to raise this army, does not follow the ordinances, does not summon a parliament, does not ask permission to raise this army. Remember, first starts talking about it in late 1313, is raising the army by the spring of 1314. So, this really fundamentally is the point that I want to get across in this video. Edward, his grand plan in 1314 to raise an army to go north into Scotland to bring Bruce to battle is, number one, a huge risk, and number two, kind of illegal. Edward, strictly speaking, is not allowed to raise this army. And it is telling that a great many figures within the kingdom, figures with a history of resistance to Edward's plans, folks like the king's cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the Earl of Warwick, who had previously been implicated in the extrajudicial execution of one of the king's favourites, Piers Gaveston. Those men refuse the muster, essentially. They don't personally show up, they send only what they are kind of legally obliged to send in terms of sort of troop numbers to this army, but they themselves refuse to participate in the army that gathers for Bannockburn. Part of the reason for that, aside from their kind of long-standing grievances with the king, is that this army is somewhat of somewhat dubious legality. It is flying in the face of the ordinances which, as far as they are concerned, Edward has signed up to and is bound by. So Edward is taking a big risk, both domestically and in terms of his war policy. He's taking a risk in alienating his lords back home, alienating the political community, or further alienating the political community. But equally, he is taking a risk because he might be about to play a rerun, essentially, of 1310. Edward is breaking an agreement, breaking a rule that he had previously accepted, and it might all end in disaster. It might be that he is going to go north, he is going to chase Bruce around Scotland just like he did in 1310, never see hide nor hear of him, have to go home with his tail between his legs, and then have to answer to his barons as to why he has done all this, spent all of their money, wasted their time, when they had previously told him not to do this again. So, this is the point that I want to get across to you, ladies and gents. This is how I would interpret Edward II's position in 1314. He is very much under pressure. He is guaranteed to outnumber whatever Scottish army he might face up north, but he is taking a massive risk in heading north in the first place. Who knows if he'll find Robert Bruce? Who knows if he'll get this opportunity to beat Bruce on the battlefield, to bring this outlaw king, if you will, to justice at last after 8 years of trying via various routes to track him down. So, why would Edward take this risk? Why would Edward allow himself to be put under this pressure? Well, ladies and gents, that is what we are going to look at in the next video. Something has changed, I would suggest, towards the end of 1313 that has convinced Edward, or encouraged Edward, to think that this campaign in 1314, which on the face of it could go so similarly to the campaign, the pretty embarrassing failed campaign of 1310, something has changed to make Edward think that actually in 1314 things might be different. Things might go a little bit better for him, that perhaps the momentum of the war is shifting in favour of the English, or that perhaps the Scots are a little bit more vulnerable than they had been 4 years previously. But that, ladies and gents, is going to be the subject of the next video. So make sure you tune in for that. It's going up on the 7th, which I think is Saturday, but might not be. It'll definitely be the 7th though. Some of you out there might know what anniversary falls on the 7th, which might help you to get some idea of what it is I'm going to talk about. But either way, folks, thank you very much for listening, and please do tune in on the 7th, whatever day that is, for video number 2 of #Bannockburn Week. Thank you, ladies and gents. See you soon.